The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the peaceful stillness of a quiet night, but a silence that presses against your chest, heavy and unrelenting. It is the kind of silence that remembers things. Then it comes, the sound that shatters it. Stone grinds against stone, echoing through the narrow limestone corridors, a rasping rhythmic scrape that feels older than language itself. You stir from uneasy rest, your palms meeting the rough chill of sandstone as you push yourself upright. The air is thick, tinged with dust, resin, and something else. Something faintly organic, unsettlingly sweet, as if life and death still mingle here in the shadows. You raise your torch, and the flame flickers weakly, throwing light across walls alive with carvings. For a heartbeat, you swear the hieroglyphs move, shifting under the glow like serpents caught mid-slither. The figures stare back at you. Gods, kings, women, priests, etched in poses too intimate, too raw, to have ever been meant for mortal eyes. These are not the polished textbook images of Egypt that adorned museum halls and school posters. No, these are stories unfiltered, stories so unsettling that archaeologists once argued whether the world was ready to see them at all. Your breath quickens. The deeper you walk, the more the walls close in, wrapping you in scenes that whisper of rituals the modern mind can scarcely comprehend. The torchlight licks across depictions of men crowned with divine regalia, their hands gripping trembling women offered as sacred vessels. Dancers, musicians, priests, every surface is alive with motion, yet all radiates a chilling purpose. These were not decorations, they were instructions. Sacred blueprints carved into stone for ceremonies that bound power, religion, and sexuality into a single, inescapable ritual. You pause, fingers grazing the cold grooves of a carved figure, and the realization settles like a weight in your gut. You are not standing in a tomb of the dead. You are standing inside a record of the living, an archive of acts both venerated and unspeakable. Every mark on these walls was a decision, a choice to sanctify suffering under the veil of divine duty. The torch sputters, and shadows dance. In that shifting light you catch the eyes of a painted woman, her head turned ever so slightly away from the god who claims her. It is the smallest gesture, but it pierces through the centuries like a cry that has never been heard. You step back, heart pounding, as if you've trespassed on something not meant to be remembered. And yet, here it all is. Step by step, the path draws you deeper, as if the tomb itself wants to tell its story. Each corridor leads not only further into stone, but further into a civilization that bound its survival to rituals of blood, sex, and control. The pharaohs built monuments to eternity, but hidden inside their walls are the truths that sustained their power, truths carved into flesh as much as they were carved into stone. The flame steadies for a moment, and you inhale the resin-heavy air. The smell of myrrh, of frankincense, of ancient oils clings to the walls. To Egyptians, these scents were sacred, a bridge between the mortal and divine. To you, they carry something else, a trace of humanity's most haunting paradox. How could beauty and brutality have walked hand in hand so seamlessly? The grinding sound comes again, far away, or maybe only in your mind. The stone itself seems to whisper warnings, voices caught in cracks, carried across millennia. You realize you are no longer a visitor. You are a witness. These corridors are speaking, and their language is not one of kings and conquests, but of bodies sacrificed, of innocence traded for promises of divine favor. You grip the torch tighter. The journey has only begun, but already you sense the truth. What you are about to uncover will not only reshape how you see Egypt, it will reshape how you see civilization itself. Step out of the corridor, and you find yourself before a chamber that seems almost theatrical in its design. Columns stretch upward like petrified trees, painted in colors that time has muted but not destroyed. Gold leaf clings stubbornly to carvings of lotus blossoms, falcons, and radiant suns. To the untrained eye, it is breathtaking, a masterpiece of harmony between art and devotion. But you already know better. Beneath the brilliance lies a story that is not about gods at all, but about men, power, and the extraordinary lengths civilizations will go to disguise brutality as holiness. Ancient Egypt was a land that wrapped itself in symbols. The pharaoh was not just a man, he was a living god, the literal embodiment of Horus on earth. His touch was said to bless. His words carried the weight of divine decree, and his very body was the axis through which heaven and earth aligned. This belief was not ornamental. It was the cornerstone of Egyptian society, the foundation that made impossible demands feel like sacred duty. If a girl was chosen for ritual service, she was not merely a victim, she was told she was the conduit of a god's will. If an embalmer defiled a corpse, he justified it as ensuring the soul's passage into eternity. The mask of divinity made everything permissible. Greek travelers, centuries later, would arrive in Egypt dazzled by its monuments, but unsettled by its practices. Herodotus, wandering through temples in the 5th century BC, wrote of ceremonies that astonished him. He described how priests claimed to act on behalf of gods in unions that were far too physical to be mistaken for allegory. What he saw shocked him deeply, yet the Egyptians around him looked on with reverence, convinced they were watching divine mysteries unfold. Imagine the scene, a festival crowd gathered beneath the columns of Karnak or Luxor, the air heavy with incense, the Nile glimmering nearby. A priest emerges, dressed in robes embroidered with symbols of fertility, his body slick with sacred oils. He is cheered not as a man, but as the living presence of Amun-Ra. The woman brought before him, often trembling, often visibly unwilling, was not seen as exploited. She was celebrated as chosen. The people believed her submission would ensure the river's flood, the harvest's bounty, the kingdom's stability. Every cry, every visible shudder was interpreted not as distress but as divine ecstasy. This was the great paradox of Egypt. Its temples proclaimed purity, but inside their sanctuaries, purity was redefined in ways that served the powerful. Ritual was a theater where human suffering could be rewritten as sacred sacrifice. The walls around you seemed to confirm this duality. One carving shows a procession of priests carrying sacred objects, their faces solemn, their posture dignified. Yet just beneath them, in a smaller register, women are shown kneeling, their bodies exposed, their hands raised in gestures of both offering and fear. To one viewer it might seem like worship, to another a record of domination sanctified by divine decree. The Egyptians themselves left no words of shame. Their papyri record offerings, chants, and meticulous ritual instructions, but rarely personal accounts of horror. The silence is almost as disturbing as the acts themselves. It suggests that society was so thoroughly enveloped in its theology that suffering itself became invisible, woven into the rhythm of life as naturally as sowing grain or drawing water. And yet, traces of unease do appear. A letter preserved from a nobleman to his son, dating around 1330 BC, carries a quiet rebellion. "The royal house breeds like beasts in their dens," he wrote, "brother with sister, father with daughter. Do not envy their thrones, for their children are cursed with twisted limbs and short years." It is a rare glimpse behind the mask, a private acknowledgement that what the state called divine might in fact be monstrous. But such voices were whispers, quickly buried beneath centuries of gold, incense, and ritual. To the world, Egypt projected power wrapped in sanctity. Its temples gleamed in the desert sun, its priests intoned hymns to the gods, and its monuments declared eternal order. Few outsiders, dazzled by grandeur, ever looked close enough to see that beneath the polished mask of divinity lay the raw face of exploitation. As you stand in the chamber, surrounded by painted gods and gilded lotus, you realize the genius of Egypt's system. They did not hide their rituals in secret rooms. They staged them in public, carved them in stone, and dared anyone to question them. The mask was not meant to conceal. It was meant to blind, to convince every generation that what was brutal was in fact beautiful, that what was cruel was eternally sacred. The torch trembles in your hand. The mask is slipping. What waits in the next quarter will not be symbols, but the flesh and blood cost of Egypt's sanctified order. The chamber narrows into a passage again, the carving shifting from divine masks and lotus crowns to scenes far more intimate. Here the lines are thinner, more urgent, as though the artist's hand trembled with the weight of what he was forced to record. Women kneel, their faces lifted not to heaven but toward men clothed in ritual regalia. Some raise offerings of bread and wine, but others, perhaps most, offer only their bodies. This is no myth. This is the architecture of control, the practice that came to be known, even in antiquity, as sacred prostitution. It often began at the top with queens, princesses, and royal widows. When a pharaoh died, his widow was rarely free to remarry of her own choosing. Instead, she was absorbed into the temple system, offered to the gods as a vessel through which divine renewal might flow. One of the most haunting stories is that of Enkhsenamun, widow of Tutankhamun. Barely past girlhood, she was pressured into ritual unions with high priests acting as the earthly embodiment of Amun. Her life was transformed from the gilded chambers of the palace to the claustrophobic sanctuaries of Karnak, where her body was no longer her own, but belonged to a god she could never see. Imagine her trembling steps into the temple's darkened chamber, gold anklets jingling as she moved toward an altar heavy with incense smoke. Before her stood not a husband, but a priest cloaked in divine authority, his role sanctioned by the state. The ritual was dressed in hymns, but its reality was flesh. In that union, politics, religion, and exploitation fused into one act. But it did not end with queens. Once normalized at the highest levels, the practice expanded downward. Archaeological evidence from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village that built the Valley of the Kings, includes papyri listing gods' wives, women and girls dedicated permanently to temple service. They were chosen not for lineage, but for beauty, purity, and pliability. The selection process was brutal. Priests examined girls stripped of clothing, scrutinizing skin, teeth, and even the symmetry of their bodies. A scar could disqualify. An uneven tooth could ruin a chance at service. In truth, those who failed were the lucky ones. Those who passed were initiated into a life of ritualized servitude, from which there was rarely escape. These women lived inside temple complexes, separated from families, dressed in distinctive linen garments that announced their status. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to bear children outside ritual duties. When they did conceive, their children were often claimed by the temple itself, raised to continue the cycle of service. It was not simply a practice, it was an institution, an entire class of women whose lives revolved around the god's supposed hunger for flesh. Records from Thebes describe the daily routine of these sacred wives. They rose before dawn to bathe in sacred pools, their bodies anointed with oils of frankincense and lotus. They were fed carefully curated diets meant to maintain beauty dates, honey, fish, and watered wine. They sang hymns, danced in processions, and when commanded, they served in rituals that blurred the line between worship and violation. To the outside world, they were revered. Pilgrims brought offerings, bowing as these women passed, believing them chosen by the gods themselves. But behind the sanctified doors, reality was less divine. The very word wife was a euphemism, a mask that concealed the unspoken truth. They were vessels, used as needed, returned to quarters until summoned again. One of the most disturbing aspects of this practice was its public nature. During major festivals, most famously the Opet festival in Thebes, crowds filled the streets, watching as the pharaoh or high priest performed sacred marriages with temple women. This was not hidden. It was staged as holy theater. Thousands gathered, singing and cheering, convinced that they were witnessing not exploitation but the union of gods and mortals. Greek historian Herodotus, visiting around 450 BC, was shaken by these ceremonies. He wrote of seeing maidens of noble birth led trembling into sanctuaries where gods appeared in human form. He noted their visible distress, but added, almost incredulously, that Egyptians around him interpreted this as divine ecstasy. Pain was rebranded as piety. Carvings from the Temple of Min at Coptos are explicit. The fertility god is shown erect. Women kneeling before him, their faces turned away in the artistic shorthand of reluctance or shame. Around them, musicians and dancers cavort, offerings pile high, creating the impression of festival rather than assault. The people clapped, believing their prosperity was being sealed. It would be tempting to view this only through religion, but the temples were also vast economic machines. Sacred prostitution generated enormous wealth. Grain, livestock, and even gold poured into temple coffers as offerings for the services of the wives of the god. Account books from the Temple of Sobek at Crocodilopolis record payments not only in coin, but in cattle and silver. During festival seasons, temple prostitution revenues eclipsed all other income streams combined. This economic power created incentive. Temples competed to expand their ranks of women, recruiting from poor families with promises of food, shelter, and divine favor. Once a daughter entered, she rarely left. Parents who tried to reclaim their children were threatened with divine curses or legal retribution. In truth, it was less recruitment than trafficking, systematic, state-sanctioned trafficking in the name of gods. And what of the women themselves? Papyri from Tebtunis, uncovered in 1899, preserve fragments of their letters. One prostitute writes to her sister, "I have served 37 men this month, and still the goddess demands more. My body aches, but worse is my heart, which grows harder each day like stone left in the sun. I pray for release, but she is silent." Graffiti scrawled into the walls of Edfu Temple echoes the same despair. "Isis knows the pain in my heart," one inscription reads, "but I cannot speak it aloud." Another, dated to 56 BC, is even starker. "I have forgotten my name. The goddess remembers my body." These words carry across time more powerfully than any hymn. They strip away the mask of sanctity and reveal the human cost, the erosion of self, the crushing of identity, the transformation of living women into nameless vessels of ritual. Even more chilling was how the system perpetuated itself. Children born from temple unions were often raised within temple walls, dedicated automatically to service. The daughters of sacred prostitutes became sacred prostitutes themselves, their fates decided before they could speak. It created generations locked into cycles of ritualized abuse, sanctified by tradition and reinforced by economic necessity. One papyrus fragment from Oxyrhynchus describes a case in which a family tried to reclaim their daughter, insisting she had not willingly vowed herself to the goddess. The temple's reply was cold. "The vow cannot be broken without offense to the divine. If she resists, the curse will fall upon her house." The family relented, and the girl vanished forever into the temple's stone chambers. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is how normalized it all became. Marriage contracts from the New Kingdom contain clauses excusing husbands from conjugal duties if their wives were summoned to temple service. Fathers negotiated bride prices that took into account whether daughters had already been dedicated. Used, women commanding lower payments despite their supposed divine blessing. Society did not hide from these practices. It absorbed them, justified them, and wove them into the rhythm of daily life. To resist was not only dangerous, it was unthinkable. The walls around you seem to close tighter as you take in these truths. What was once described in tourist guides as ritual marriage or sacred duty now reads with new clarity. It was systematic, public, and devastating. The gods demanded flesh, and the people gave it freely, convinced their survival depended on it. The torch sputters, and for a moment the hieroglyphs seem to whisper again. This was not an anomaly. It was not a footnote. It was the heart of Egypt's religion for nearly 2,000 years. And the deeper you go, the more terrible the rituals become. The passage twists again, and suddenly the walls change. The gods' towering forms give way to scenes more focused, more intimate, and far more disturbing. Here, carved in stark precision, are figures of young girls, barely women, led by priestesses toward altars heavy with offerings. Their small frames are draped in translucent linen, their wrists adorned with gold bands far too large for their fragile limbs. At their sides, priests hold implements that gleam in the torchlight, knives, carved phalluses of wood and stone, ceremonial staffs. You have stumbled into the record of one of Egypt's most brutal traditions, the ritual of sacred defloration. To the priests who commanded Egypt's spiritual life, virginity was not simply purity, it was power. They believed that untouched girls carried a concentration of divine energy that could be harvested only once in an act of ritual penetration. To spill this blood was to release vitality into the world, vitality that fed gods, ensured the Nile's flood, and blessed the harvest. Thus, the violation of innocence was rewritten as sacrifice. What in any other age might have been condemned as violence was transformed into holy necessity. To resist was not just rebellion against men, it was defiance against the gods themselves. Papyrus fragments from the Ramesseum, Egypt's grand mortuary temple, describe the theology in chilling clarity. The blood of the maiden is the water of the field, the cries of the girl are the hymns of the gods. By this act the land is made fertile and the king's reign secure. Girls were not thrust into this fate suddenly, their initiation began days in advance. They were chosen often between the ages of 9 and 14 by temple scouts who traveled villages during festival seasons, Families were offered gifts of grain, livestock, or coin, but refusal brought threats of divine punishment. Few resisted. Once chosen, the girls were brought into temple compounds, where a 3-day preparation began. They bathed in sacred pools perfumed with lotus and myrrh. Oils were rubbed into their skin until they shone, their bodies treated as offerings polished for the altar. They were fed diets heavy with honey, dates, and fish foods believed to sweeten the body for divine consumption. They were not allowed to speak except to priestesses who instructed them in ritual roles. Silence was demanded. Fear was forbidden. Any sign of hesitation, they were told, would anger the gods. When the day arrived, the girl was dressed in a gown so sheer it might as well have been mist. Around her neck hung amulets carved with the images of Hathor or Isis, goddesses invoked to sanctify what was about to occur. She was led before a gathered assembly, not in private chambers, but in full view of officials, scribes, and sometimes even festival crowds. Incense filled the sanctuary. Musicians played hymns in slow, pulsing rhythms meant to echo the heartbeat of the cosmos. Then the high priest stepped forward. He did not come as himself, but as a god's vessel. To the people watching, this was not a man deflowering a child. This was Amun, Min, or Horus claiming his bride. The act itself was often performed not by the man alone, but with ritual tools, knives, carved phalluses, or rods, preserved as sacred relics after use. The blood that followed was considered divine proof. Priests caught it on linen cloths and displayed them as signs of the god's favor. Greek traveler Strabo, writing in 25 BC, described his horror at witnessing such rites during a festival at Koptos. He wrote of maidens no older than children, their cries drowned by drums, their bodies made offerings to gods who wear the faces of men. The psychological and physical aftermath was profound. Skeletal remains of girls uncovered at Abydos show pelvic fractures, infections, and in some cases fatal internal injuries consistent with violent assault. Many did not survive the ceremonies. Those who did were often dedicated permanently to temple life, marked as sacred vessels, unable to marry, and expected to repeat their roles in future rituals. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri contain chilling references to what they called divine madness, symptoms modern readers recognize as trauma. One fragment prescribes herbs for a maiden who weeps without cause and refuses food. Another describes treatments for girls who scream in their sleep, who do not know their mothers, who scratch their faces with their own hands. But rather than acknowledge the suffering, priests reinterpreted these symptoms as signs of divine touch. Trauma became sanctity. Pain became proof. Some priests specialized in these ceremonies, their positions recorded with disturbing pride. The Chester Beatty Papyrus V, an administrative record from around 1200 BC, lists titles such as Opener of the Sacred Passage and Bearer of the Divine Staff. These men received higher food rations, better housing, and even privileges of selecting which girls they would deflower. Positions were often hereditary, passed from father to son. It created dynasties of ritual abusers cloaked in divine authority. Though the theology was consistent, the ceremonies varied across Egypt. In Lower Egypt, the rituals were tied to the Nile's inundation. Girls' blood was symbolically linked to the river's life-giving waters. In Upper Egypt, the ceremonies coincided with harvest festivals, the defloration seen as ensuring fertility for both crops and herds. At Koptos, entire groups of girls were deflowered simultaneously during mass rituals. Witnesses described festival crowds throwing flowers, cheering as blood stained the temple stones. Deaths from shock or blood loss were celebrated as proof of divine acceptance. Families did not always resist. In some cases, they bargained. Temple ledgers from Thebes reveal that parents were compensated with land, livestock, or tax exemptions for surrendering daughters. But these payments often came only after the rituals were complete, ensuring compliance. Families who tried to withdraw daughters beforehand faced confiscation of property or exile. One papyrus fragment preserves the voice of quiet rebellion. It records a whispered message passed among families. When the lotus seekers come to your door, remember the river runs deep but runs away. Scholars believe this was coded language urging escape before temple recruiters arrived. A faint trace of resistance, quickly extinguished by the weight of the state. What haunts most is not only the brutality, but the silence that followed. No official records describe it as abuse. No priest acknowledged guilt. Instead, walls and papyri celebrated the acts as triumphs of ritual. The girls who lived through them rarely left testimonies. If they spoke at all, their words were framed as hymns of devotion. Their pain became invisible, their humanity erased under the weight of religious necessity. Yet the evidence remains. The bones, the papyri, the graffiti etched by desperate hands, all whisper the same truth. What was called sacred was often little more than violence in ceremonial disguise. You lower the torch, the carvings flickering in shadow. The air feels heavier here, as if the walls themselves hold echoes of screams long since silenced. Ritualized defloration was not an aberration, it was a cornerstone. Egypt's temples thrived on it, its festivals celebrated it, its theology demanded it. And the deeper you descend into this labyrinth of stone, the clearer it becomes. In the name of gods, innocence itself was the first sacrifice. The torch burns lower, its smoke curling against the ceiling, but the walls around you are suddenly different. Gone are the scenes of processions and festivals. Here the stone is filled with images of workshops, embalmers at their tables, jars of canopic organs lined neatly, priests bending over bodies. At first it seems routine, the familiar business of Egyptian death, the 70-day journey from flesh to eternity. But the longer you look, the more unsettling the details become. The hands of the embalmers linger where they should not. Figures of women lie exposed, their bodies positioned in ways that feel deliberate, suggestive. Between the hieroglyphs of sacred ritual, there is something darker carved into stone, the unspoken secret of Egyptian mummification. It is here you encounter what Egypt itself tried to hide, the ancient world's most disturbing silence, the violation of corpses. The earliest whispers come not from Egyptian sources, but from outsiders. In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote with cryptic caution, "Families of beautiful women," he said, delayed delivering their daughters' bodies to the embalmers. They waited 3 or 4 days, fearing what might happen if their loved ones were too fresh, too tempting. He hinted at one case in which an embalmer was caught, punished, not for the crime itself, but for being discovered. For centuries, scholars debated what Herodotus meant. Was it exaggeration, misunderstanding? Or was it the faintest glimpse of a reality Egyptians dared not inscribe? Modern science has answered with chilling clarity. In 2005, a team led by Dr. Zahi Hawass conducted CT scans on dozens of female mummies housed in Cairo. What they found shocked even hardened Egyptologists. Roughly 23% bore unmistakable signs of post-mortem sexual trauma. Damage to pelvic bones, tearing in preserved tissue, and resin residue suggested that the bodies had been accessed after death but before final wrapping. The evidence was consistent, recurring across dynasties and classes. What Herodotus hinted at, the scans confirmed. Necrophilia was not an isolated crime. It was systematic and, in some circles, ritualized. Fragments of papyri from Deir el-Bahari, discovered in 1881, include instructions for embalmers. Written in hieratic script, they describe opening all sacred passages of the deceased woman as part of purification. For decades, scholars assumed this meant the surgical removal of organs. But closer readings, alongside physical evidence, suggest something far more sinister. The language is anatomical, yes, but disturbingly specific references not to evisceration, but to acts of penetration, couched in religious euphemism. It was not enough to preserve the body. It had to be used. The embalming process lasted 70 days. During this time, bodies remained in workshops near the Nile. Families were excluded, their role limited to payment and ritual visits. The rest was left to the embalmers, men who often worked at night when the city slept. Records from Tanis, dating around 1000 BC, note that embalmers preferred the night shift when the spirits are nearest. In reality, night offered privacy and opportunity. Imagine the scene. A mud-brick chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, the air heavy with natron and bitumen. An embalmer, alone, stands before the body of a young noblewoman, her skin still pliable, her face still beautiful. Religious justifications are close at hand. To touch her is to channel her life force, to steal vitality, to draw protection from Osiris himself. And so he acts, not as a criminal in his own eyes, but as a ritualist. The Harris Papyrus, now in the British Museum, includes legal documents from 56 BC describing prosecutions of embalmers accused of defiling the sacred vessels. The phrase is deliberately vague, euphemistic, but modern scholars interpret it as reference to sexual violation of corpses. Punishments were harsh. Convicted men were executed, their families stripped of wealth and banished. But note this, the crime was not condemned as immoral. It was condemned as disorderly, dangerous to the temple's reputation. The sin was not the act. The sin was being caught. Why did they do it? The evidence points not to depravity alone, but to ritualized belief. Amulets recovered from embalming workshops depict explicit sexual acts between men and bound female figures. Papyrus spells preserved in Thebes instruct the embalmer to recite invocations as he enters the vessel of beauty, that her life may pass into his. It was magic, twisted and inverted. Necrophilia became a form of communion, a way to steal vitality, enhance virility, or even secure longer life. For some, the corpse was not simply a body, it was a reservoir of power. Among the most infamous examples is Meketaten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Dead at only 13, her mummy was found with pelvic wrappings disturbed, resin residues layered strangely, as if the body had been accessed multiple times during mummification. For decades, scholars attributed the damage to tomb robbers, but modern forensic reanalysis suggests otherwise. The pattern was deliberate, careful, ritualistic. Meketaten was not robbed. She was used. The psychological toll on embalmers themselves is recorded in grim statistics. Administrative records from Memphis show embalming workers dying by suicide at rates far higher than other professions. Many drowned themselves in the Nile, a method Egyptians believed destroyed the soul, preventing entrance into the afterlife. To kill oneself in this way was considered the ultimate self-punishment, a refusal of eternity. Did guilt drive them to it? Were they haunted by what they had done in the secrecy of night, or were they tormented by the fear of exposure? Whatever the reason, their deaths leave a chilling footnote. Even those who carried out the ritual sometimes could not live with them. Perhaps most horrific of all are the cases suggesting women were murdered for the purpose of necrophilic ritual. In the Saqqara necropolis, the mummy of a young woman was found poisoned with oleander, a fast-acting toxin that preserved her beauty even in death. Beside her wrappings were papyrus fragments containing prayers of forgiveness, as if her embalmer knew he had crossed a line too far. She had not simply died, she had been prepared. The thought chills you. Egypt's funerary industry may not only have exploited the dead, it may have created them. Later voices recoiled. In the 4th century AD, Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria thundered against embalmers who defile the dead in the name of gods who are themselves demons. To early Christians, the practice was not only perverse, but proof of Egypt's corruption. Families abandoned embalming altogether, preferring simple burials to the risk of violation. But by then, the damage was done. Centuries of ritualized necrophilia had left their mark in bodies, in papyri, in whispered warnings preserved by outsiders. Your torchlight flickers across one final carving. An embalmer kneels over a woman's body, his hands placed not in reverence but in possession. Around him swirl hieroglyphs of protection, as if to sanctify the unspeakable. The image is not hidden in some secret niche. It is carved openly, daring anyone to question. For Egypt, this was not crime, this was ritual. The silence of stone speaks louder than words. The dead were not safe. Beauty itself was a curse, attracting not reverence but violation. And in the hands of men cloaked in divine authority, even the grave offered no protection. What remains is not just disgust, but dread. Dread that a civilization so advanced, so celebrated, so monumental could hide within its rituals something so monstrous. Dread that the very practices meant to preserve eternity were corrupted by impulses that robbed the dead of dignity. Dread that when we speak of Egypt's grandeur, we are also speaking of its shadows. The tomb exhales dust, the torch sputters again. You are left with the knowledge that behind every painted coffin, behind every golden mask, there may lie a secret never spoken aloud, that the dead, too, were prey. The air changes again. The walls here gleam faintly with polished plaster, still carrying the painted hues of figures whose faces are painfully familiar, pharaohs, queens, and princesses. They are shown in pairs, husband and wife, brother and sister, father and daughter. At first, the images appear no different from the endless depictions of royal families across Egypt, but the hieroglyphs are precise, the titles unambiguous. These were not symbolic unions. They were real marriages, sanctioned by divine decree, and they were the law of Egypt's throne. You have entered the hall of incest, the quiet catastrophe that shaped an empire's bloodline. The ideology was simple, even seductive. The pharaoh was not just king, he was God. And gods did not obey mortal rules. Just as Isis and Osiris were siblings joined as lovers, so too could Egypt's rulers claim their divine legitimacy by marrying their own blood. To wed a sister was to imitate the gods. To father children with daughters was to sanctify the royal line. The temple inscriptions did not whisper. They proclaimed it proudly, "She is my sister, she is my wife, united in the flesh as Horus and Hathor." What others might have seen as corruption, Egypt dressed in the robes of eternity. Incest within Egypt's ruling house began early, around 3000 BC, with the first dynasties. But it was in the 18th dynasty, 1550–195 BC, that the practice reached extremes. Pharaoh Thutmose then married his sister Ahmose. Their son, Thutmose II, took his half-sister Hatshepsut as wife. The cycle tightened with every generation, the pool of acceptable partners shrinking until choice was erased entirely. What began as religious symbolism hardened into political necessity. Royal women were too valuable to give away to foreign rulers, too dangerous to marry into powerful noble families. And so they were kept inside the palace walls, married to brothers, fathers, uncles, even their own sons. One of the most tragic voices in this cycle was Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, later the young bride of Tutankhamun, her own half-brother. When Tutankhamun died at 19, she was left vulnerable. In desperation, she wrote to the king of the Hittites, begging him to send a son for marriage. "I have no son. They say you have many. If you send me one, he shall be my husband. I will never marry a servant of mine. I am afraid." Her words reveal the horror behind the gilded titles. She feared being forced into union with her father-in-law or another relative, trapped once more in the cycle of incest. The Hittite prince sent to her was murdered en route, likely by Egyptian officials. Ankhesenamun vanished from history soon after, her fate swallowed by the silence of the court. For centuries, scholars debated the extent of these practices. Then came the science. In 2010, geneticist Dr. Karsten Pusch and his team conducted DNA testing on 11 royal mummies from the New Kingdom. The results were devastating. Tutankhamun was the child of a brother-sister union. He carried multiple congenital disorders, clubfoot, cleft palate, scoliosis, and evidence of temporal lobe epilepsy. His own daughters, 2 infant mummies buried with him, were also the product of incest, their skeletons showing severe neural tube defects. Of the 11 royals tested, 9 were born from incestuous unions. 7 showed signs of genetic disease. What the papyri hinted, the bones confirmed, the royal house had become a biological disaster. For royal women, the burden was unbearable. Ankhesenamun, Mutimwiya, and Khasimpatun. Their names echo in the tombs, but their lives tell the same story. Trapped in palaces, rarely allowed outside sunlight, their health deteriorated. Bone analysis from several mummies shows vitamin D deficiency, stress fractures, and chronic malnutrition despite their wealth. Many bore multiple children, most of whom died at birth or in infancy. One queen's remains, discovered in 2010, revealed signs of depression etched into her skeleton, stress fractures, porous bones, miscarriages. Her life was gilded with titles, but her body bore the scars of unending pregnancies and suffocating confinement. Incest was not simply biology, it reshaped the very psychology of the court. Imagine growing up as a princess in Akhenaten's palace at Amarna. Your father is also your lover. Your brothers are also your husbands. Your children may also be your siblings. Records from the period reveal how titles twisted to accommodate these roles: sister of the body, wife of the house, daughter of the throne. Language bent itself into knots trying to describe relationships that defied nature. Relief carvings from Amarna even depict Akhenaten kissing one daughter while another sits on his lap, the hieroglyphs explicitly naming them as both his children and wives. To Egyptians, it was divine symbolism. To modernize, it is the collapse of family into a cycle of exploitation. Not everyone was convinced. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and neighboring kingdoms, reveal the unease of foreign rulers. One king of Mitanni wrote to Amenhotep III, "Your daughters are wives, your wives are daughters. This confuses my scribes. Why do you not send one to me in marriage, as is custom?" Even in an age where dynastic marriages were political tools, Egypt's insularity horrified outsiders. By keeping royal women trapped in incest, Egypt isolated itself from alliances that might have strengthened it. The throne was preserved, but at what cost? Here and there, faint whispers of resistance survive. A letter from a princess named Bakataten, preserved in fragments, describes her attempt to flee to the Hittite court. "My father would make me his wife as he did my sisters. Better to die in a foreign land than live against the law of nature." She was returned by Egyptian soldiers. Nothing more is known of her. Other papyri describe noble families condemning royal incest in private. One father warned his son, "The royal house breeds like beasts in their dens. This is why their children are cursed with twisted limbs." But such words were dangerous. Publicly, the system stood unchallenged. The consequences compounded with each generation. By the end of the 18th dynasty, infant mortality in the royal house exceeded 60%. Surviving children were often weak, deformed, or plagued with illness. Tutankhamun himself, one of Egypt's most famous kings, could barely walk unaided. He died at 19, his body riddled with disease, his reign short and fragile. The royal line that claimed eternity had undermined itself. In trying to preserve divine blood, it poisoned it. The royal cache discovered in 1881 at Deir el-Bahari confirmed the collapse. Of the 11 mummies unearthed, nearly all showed evidence of incestuous heritage. Some had club feet. Others had elongated skulls, spines twisted, limbs malformed. They were buried with gold, but their bodies carried the truth of a dynasty that devoured itself from within. And yet, Egypt never acknowledged failure. Reliefs still show royal couples presenting offerings to gods, their sibling bonds praised as sacred unions. Tomb inscriptions insist their children were perfect in form, eternal in youth. The mask of divinity was never dropped. The suffering was never admitted, but the evidence speaks otherwise. DNA, bones, broken bodies, all reveal what stone could not, that incest was not divine blessing, but curse. It weakened the very line it sought to preserve. It hollowed Egypt's throne from within, leaving behind kings who limped, queens who withered, and infants who never drew breath. The walls around you shimmer with the faces of those caught in this cycle. Tutankhamun, fragile and sickly. Ankhesenamun, desperate and silenced. Akhenaten, radiant in reliefs but monstrous in reality. Their eyes, painted in black coal, stare out as if daring you to judge. This was not aberration. This was system. Incest was Egypt's law of power, sanctified by religion, enforced by politics, and paid for in blood. Its legacy lies not only in DNA, but in the ruins of a dynasty that collapsed under its own corruption. You take a breath, the torch trembling in your grip. Ahead lies another chamber, another shadow waiting to be uncovered. But already the truth presses heavy. Egypt's throne was built not only on stone and gold, but on the broken bodies of its own children. The passage broadens, and the walls change yet again. The vibrant depictions of earthly festivals give way to scenes of the underworld. Spirits float across painted plaster. Gods with jackal heads and falcon wings weigh souls upon golden scales. At first glance, it is familiar. The comforting imagery of Egyptian afterlife so often displayed in museums. But as your torch drifts lower, new details emerge. Female figures are posed not in rest, but in service, kneeling, reclining, their hands outstretched to male spirits and gods. Some are wrapped in linens but positioned provocatively, their bodies prepared not for repose but for access. In this place, you realize, death did not free Egyptian women. It only chained them more tightly. The afterlife, so glorified in papyri and tomb paintings, was for many imagined not as paradise but as eternal servitude. The oldest funerary writings, the pyramid texts, c. 2400 BC, are blunt in their promise. Pharaohs who ascend to the heavens are told, "You shall possess the wives of the gods. They shall satisfy your desires as they satisfied their husbands in life." To the Egyptian mind, the afterlife was not an escape from sexuality, but an amplification of it. Women were envisioned as companions, concubines, servants, forever. The later Book of the Dead reinforces this. Chapter 125, the famous negative confession, includes a vow unique to women. I have not withheld myself from the righteous man. I have opened myself to him who has earned favor. In other words, even in judgment, a woman's soul was measured by her willingness to provide sexual service. This belief seeped into the very practice of mummification. Documents from the embalming workshops of Thebes describe procedures not performed on men, but only on women. Resin-soaked linen was inserted into the vaginal canal, preserving its shape for eternity. Some bodies were buried with phallic objects of ivory, wood, or stone, positioned between their legs and wrapped carefully to remain accessible. Excavations of the tomb of QV55, likely belonging to a daughter of Ramses II, revealed such objects wrapped and blessed with inscriptions calling them gifts of Hathor for eternity. What one generation might describe as religious preparation, another sees for what it was, an institutional expectation that women would continue to be used long after death. In a noble tomb dated to around 1450 BC, wall paintings depict the deceased vizier Ram Tedi reclining, wine in hand, while female servants, some named, others anonymous, kneel before him. The hieroglyphs describe them as eternal companions. The painting is not metaphor. It is an instruction manual. These women were sacrificed to join him in death, strangled or poisoned to ensure they could serve him beyond the grave. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Subsidiary tombs at Abydos and Saqqara reveal the remains of young women buried alongside kings and nobles. Forensic analysis shows clear signs of strangulation, broken necks, or poisoning with oleander. Their sacrifice was deliberate, their role eternal servitude. Among the mummies of the 21st dynasty lies Queen Henetawi, wife of the high priest Pinigem I. Her body reveals something deeply unsettling. Her legs were bound open during wrapping, her pelvis padded with resin-soaked cloth, her wrappings adjusted repeatedly. To earlier archaeologists, this was dismissed as damage or ritual anomaly. But forensic reanalysis points toward a darker truth. Her body was deliberately positioned to facilitate access by spirits or by embalmers themselves. One of the earliest pharaohs, Jer-C 3000 BC, was buried with 338 subsidiary graves, many containing young women. Their skeletons show uniform signs of death, strangulation, bludgeoning, poisoning. These women were not concubines in life, they were offerings for eternity. Later dynasties abandoned the mass killings, but the ideology lingered. Instead of whole harems buried alive, women were symbolically preserved for the same function. By the New Kingdom, female corpses were prepared with special care, painted faces, perfumed wigs, genital preservation. Eternity was envisioned not as equality, but as perpetual concubinage. Not all accepted this fate quietly. Personal letters from women of the New Kingdom, preserved in fragments, reveal dread of death itself. One woman wrote to her sister, "I fear not the pain of dying, but the endless service that awaits. In life I choose my husband. In death I must open to all." Another fragment from Saqqara contains a chilling plea. "Let me die before my beauty fades, for the ugly are spared in eternity." For these women, aging was not feared for vanity, but as escape from sexual bondage in the afterlife. Later foreign visitors recoiled at these practices. In 50 BC, historian Diodorus Siculus described funerals where women's bodies were dressed as courtesans, perfumed and adorned before burial, as though they prepared for a wedding rather than a tomb. He noted with shock how much care was devoted to preserving their sexual features, lips painted, thighs wrapped, breasts supported with linen padding. To Egyptians, this was devotion. To outsiders, it was degradation sanctified as ritual. The tragic irony is that what Egyptians viewed as blessing, the guarantee of companionship in eternity, was in fact a curse. For men, eternity promised unending pleasure. For women, it promised endless servitude. To be born beautiful was to be sentenced twice, once in life to temples and rituals, and once in death to eternal availability. It is no wonder that suicides among embalmers, the very men who enacted these rituals, were abnormally high. Some hurled themselves into the Nile, an act Egyptians believed destroyed the soul entirely, preventing afterlife. Perhaps they knew too well what they had done to the dead and feared their victims' eternal revenge. You lower your torch. The images flicker, and for a moment the women on the walls seem almost to move. Their painted eyes glance sideways, their lips pressed tight, their bodies forever posed in postures of service. It is not paradise. It is prison. The silence of the chamber presses close. The truth is unbearable, that for Egyptian women, death was not release, but captivity without end. Their beauty preserved not as memory, but as function. Their bodies embalmed not for dignity, but for use. And in this you see the pattern. Egypt sanctified suffering, cloaked violence in ritual, and carried its victims not only through life but into eternity. The tomb narrows again, the corridors twisting toward their end. You follow the fading light until you reach a hall where the scenes change entirely. No longer do the walls display proud pharaohs or radiant queens. Instead, the carvings grow hurried, the lines less precise, as though artists themselves had lost conviction. Here, Egypt's glory begins to falter. You are standing at the threshold of collapse. For centuries, Egypt had cloaked its rituals in grandeur. Sacred prostitution, ritual defloration, necrophilia, incest, all woven into theology, hidden behind gold and incense. But by the final dynasties, the mask had begun to slip. The Nile's floods grew erratic. Foreign invasions pressed against Egypt's borders. The gods' favor, so long assured, seemed uncertain. Common people whispered what priests dared not. Perhaps the rituals had failed. Perhaps the blood of virgins, the suffering of women, the sacrifices of daughters were not pleasing the gods at all. And as doubt grew, so too did silence. The rituals never ceased, but fewer inscriptions recorded them. Where once walls were crowded with erotic carvings of gods and brides, later temples show vague symbols, euphemisms, omissions. Egypt's greatest sin was not abolished, it was simply hidden. In 30 BC, Octavian, soon-to-be Augustus, marched into Alexandria. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt ceased to be a kingdom. It became a province of Rome. Among the conqueror's first acts was to suppress Egypt's most notorious temple rites. Sacred prostitution was banned, ritual defloration outlawed, public ceremonies of divine unions dissolved. To Romans, the Egyptian system was dangerous not only morally, but politically. Temples had become centers of wealth and power, funded by sexual services that filled their treasuries. By abolishing them, Rome stripped priests of influence and redirected revenue into imperial coffers. The suppression was swift, but the scars remained. Temples still bore explicit carvings. Inscriptions still described marriages of gods and daughters. Rome did not erase the past, it simply forbade its continuation. Centuries later, Christian missionaries arrived, and with them came horror. Bishops wrote scathing condemnations of Egyptian funerary practices, denouncing embalmers who defiled the dead, and priests who taught daughters to open themselves to idols. By the 4th century AD, Egyptian mummification was in decline. Christian families refused the old rites, preferring simple burials. To them, embalming was not preservation, it was corruption. And in their sermons, the practices of Egypt became warnings, examples of how a civilization could sanctify sin until it destroyed itself. What is most striking is how thoroughly Egypt itself silenced these stories. Inscriptions that once described ritual in proud detail grew vague, euphemistic, or vanished entirely. Marriage contracts hint at temple service, but never describe it plainly. Medical papyri prescribe treatments for trauma, but call it divine madness. Graffiti carved by desperate women are the rarest voices, whispers in a desert of silence. Egypt, the master of record-keeping, chose not to record its darkest truths. The walls remember, but they remember in symbols, in shadows, in carvings that outsiders misinterpreted for centuries. When we gaze at Egypt today, we see pyramids gleaming in the sun, statues of kings carved from stone, hieroglyphs stretching across colossal walls. We marvel at its genius, its architecture, its mathematics, its astronomy, its art. But within the same civilization, within the same stones, lies another legacy, one written not in triumph but in tears. Women raised to be brides of gods, only to become victims of priests. Children prepared for sacrifice, their first blood spilled for the harvest. Corpses embalmed not with dignity, but with violation. royal families collapsing beneath the weight of their own incest. Egypt built eternity, but eternity was never equal. By the time Rome arrived, Egypt's dynasty was already hollow. The royal bloodline had broken itself through inbreeding. Its priests, once powerful, had lost credibility. Its rituals, once celebrated, had grown shameful. The very practices that claimed to secure the gods' favor had instead weakened a kingdom from within. Collapse did not come from without alone. It came from within, from centuries of sanctifying the unspeakable until the system devoured itself. As you raise your torch for the last time, the carvings flicker like ghosts. Every corridor you have walked, every chamber you have entered, tells the same story, a civilization that confused cruelty for devotion, that made suffering sacred, that blinded itself with gold until it could no longer see the blood beneath. The silence is absolute now. Egypt will never confess its sins. But the stone whispers anyway. It tells us that behind every monument, behind every empire, there may lie secrets written not in glory, but in pain. That the rituals we sanctify may one day be judged as crimes. That civilizations fall not only from conquest, but from what they choose to normalize. Step back into the daylight. The Nile glitters. The desert wind brushes your face. But you cannot forget the corridors behind you. You cannot unsee the women carved into stone, forever kneeling. Egypt's monuments stand eternal. But so too does the lesson. The mask of the sacred can hide anything, even the monstrous. The torchlight softens as you step into a chamber unlike the others. The walls here are crowded, not with images of Egypt alone, but with scenes of faraway lands. Babylon, Athens, Rome, even across the oceans to temples of Mesoamerica. The carvings seem to whisper the same refrain: Egypt was not alone. Across the world, civilizations wrestled with power, sexuality, and the sacred. Yet, no other land fused them with such relentless ritual as the Nile's kingdom. Long before Egypt's dynasties rose, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia practiced the sacred marriage ritual. In the city of Uruk, each spring, the king united with the high priestess of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Their union, witnessed by priests and sung in hymns, was believed to ensure fertility of the land. Unlike Egypt, where young girls were chosen en masse, Mesopotamia concentrated the rite in one exalted pairing. It was political theater as much as spiritual practice, yet the lines blurred. In temple districts of Babylon, Herodotus recorded that every woman, once in her life, was expected to enter the temple of Ishtar and submit to a stranger in exchange for a coin cast into the goddess's lap. The act was called holy, the payment an offering. Echoes of Egypt's temple prostitution resound here, but with one crucial difference. In Mesopotamia, it was a civic duty brief, humiliating, but not lifelong servitude. Egypt institutionalized what others required once. Turn next to Greece, and you find myths draped in beauty, but carrying disturbing undertones. Gods disguised as men or animals seduced or violated. Mortal women, Zeus as a swan with Leda, as a shower of gold with Danae, as a bull with Europa. These myths, carved on temple walls and painted on pottery, sacralized coercion. In Sparta, girls were seized at festivals, carried off to forced marriages framed as tradition. In Athens, cults of Dionysus and fertility festivals included drunken revelry where boundaries dissolved and women's roles blurred between devotee and victim. But unlike Egypt, Greece often displaced these rituals into myth rather than systematic institutional practice. The violence remained, but wrapped in storytelling instead of temple bureaucracy. Rome inherited much from both Greece and Egypt, but transformed it through discipline. Roman religion was transactional, bound by contracts with the gods. Sacred prostitution appeared less openly, though cults of Venus and foreign deities brought echoes. Instead, Rome's cruelty manifested in spectacle. At the Colosseum, women condemned as criminals or captives were stripped and thrown to animals or forced into staged sexual humiliations disguised as myth reenactments. Roman poets hint at gladiatorial marriages, public deflorations of slaves, and ritualized violence framed as entertainment. Rome rejected Egypt's temple sexuality, but only to replace it with brutality on the stage. For Egyptians, it was ritual. For Romans, it was theater. In both cases, women's bodies became currency. Far to the east, in India, the Devadasi system emerged. Girls dedicated to temple service, married symbolically to gods, and often forced into sexual servitude to priests and patrons. Texts from medieval India describe temple dancers whose sacred duty blurred into prostitution. Like Egypt's gods' wives, they lived within temple walls, forbidden to marry, trapped in a cycle of service. But India's difference lay in continuity. While Egypt's rituals collapsed under Rome and Christianity, echoes of the Devadasi system lingered into the modern era, only legally abolished in the 20th century. A chilling reminder that sacred exploitation does not always stay in the past. Cross the ocean to the temples of the Maya and Aztec, and you find another echo of Egypt's fusion of sexuality, sacrifice, and divinity. Aztec rituals paired sexual violation with human sacrifice. Captured maidens were paraded as brides of gods, then deflowered before their throats were cut. Their blood was spilled not to sanctify crops, but to feed deities who demanded constant nourishment. In the Maya world, fertility rituals sometimes involved girls offered to rain gods, their bodies thrown into cenotes, sacred wells, after being adorned as brides. Where Egypt bound women to afterlife servitude, Mesoamerica offered them to death itself, believing their sacrifice brought rain. And yet, in comparing, one sees Egypt's singularity. Other civilizations practice sacred prostitution, ritual defloration, incest, or sacrifice, but rarely all together and never with Egypt's meticulous record-keeping. Egyptians codified these practices in papyri, carved them into stone, preserved them in contracts and medical texts. They were not whispered aberrations. They were the machinery of empire. While Babylon confined temple prostitution to a civic duty, Egypt institutionalized it across generations. While Greece disguised coercion in myth, Egypt etched it into law. While Rome staged violence for entertainment, Egypt embedded it in theology. While Mesoamerica sacrificed the body once, Egypt conscripted it for life and even beyond death. This was Egypt's unique horror. Not that it shared practices with neighbors, but that it systematized them, sanctified them, eternalized them. The Greek historian Strabo recoiled at Egyptian festivals where girls bled on altars. Diodorus Siculus wrote of funerals where women were dressed as courtesans. Foreign kings wrote letters expressing confusion at incestuous marriages. Again and again, outsiders bore witness, their shock preserved in text. And yet, Egypt endured. Its walls silenced protest. Its rituals continued for centuries after critics left. Unlike Greece or Rome, which reshaped their myths and abolished practices more quickly, Egypt clung to its cycle until its collapse. The comparisons reveal something unsettling. Egypt was not unique in exploiting women under the guise of the sacred. Across cultures, sexuality and violence were intertwined with religion and power. What changes is the degree, the visibility, the justification. Some cloaked it in myth, others in ritual, others in spectacle. But the pattern is universal. Civilizations elevate their cruelty by sanctifying it. And Egypt stands as the starkest example, not because it invented these practices, but because it perfected them, carved them in stone, and promised they would last forever. The chamber's walls close in, the carvings blending into one another. Babylon beside Thebes, Rome beside Amarna, Aztec pyramids beside Egyptian tombs. The message is clear. What we call civilization is never free of shadow. Egypt's shadows may be the deepest, but their echoes are everywhere. The torch sputters, the air grows heavy. And still, the stones whisper, Egypt was not alone. The tomb walls fade into shadow, and for the first time, silence is broken not by priests or pharaohs, but by men in wide-brimmed hats, carrying brushes and lanterns. The scene shifts centuries forward to the age of rediscovery, when the sands of Egypt gave up their secrets to archaeology. What priests once hid, modern science uncovered. In 1881, excavations at Deir el-Bahari revealed caches of papyri and mummies that astonished and disturbed Europe. Some of the papyri spoke bluntly of gods' wives and temple duties, their euphemisms hinting at sexual servitude. Archaeologists debated whether to publish translations, fearful of scandal in Victorian society. Many documents were quietly locked away in museum vaults, labeled restricted. At Bubastis, excavators unearthed thousands of clay tokens bearing sexual imagery alongside the cat goddess Bastet. They were not jewelry but payment tokens, receipts for temple prostitution. To the discoverers, it was undeniable evidence that ritualized sexuality had been at the very heart of Egyptian worship. Equally troubling were the medical papyri. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and Kahun Gynecological Papyrus contained remedies for trauma in women, sleeplessness, sudden crying, refusal to eat, what priests called divine madness. Today, psychologists recognize these as symptoms of abuse. To ancient physicians, they were simply ailments to be treated so women could return to duty. The texts made clear what stone carvings had disguised. Ritualized exploitation left not just physical scars, but psychological ones. Then came the mummies themselves. With the advent of CT scans and DNA testing, the dead spoke in ways hieroglyphs never had. In 2005, scans revealed pelvic trauma in nearly a quarter of examined female mummies, consistent with postmortem violation. In 2010, genetic studies exposed the royal family's collapse. Tutankhamun, crippled by inbreeding, his daughters dead from deformities. Science stripped away Egypt's golden masks. Beneath the perfection of painted coffins lay bodies twisted by incest, corpses scarred by abuse, children who never survived the cycle. Today, the question remains, how much should be shown? Museums wrestle with displaying erotic reliefs, explicit carvings, or artifacts of sacred prostitution. For decades, many kept them in private collections, fearing public outrage. Only recently have curators begun to present them openly, acknowledging that to hide them is to repeat Egypt's own silence. Yet even now, visitors stand before glass cases of mummies and see only mystery, not pain. The truth remains too raw, too uncomfortable. Egypt's greatness is easier to celebrate than its shadows. And yet, archaeology insists we face both. Every CT scan, every DNA test, every fragment of papyrus pulls another thread from Egypt's veil. What priests once sanctified as holy is revealed by science as human cruelty. What they called divine, we recognize as exploitation. In the quiet of museums, under sterile lights, the mummies whisper as loudly as they ever did in their tombs, "Remember what was hidden." You step into the last chamber. It is smaller than the others, quieter, as though the stones themselves are weary. The air is still, the torch almost gone. On the walls are no gods, no festivals, no corpses prepared for eternity, only mirrors of polished stone, reflecting your own face. This is not their story anymore. It is ours. Egypt's darkest truths were not accidents. They were not hidden sins of a few, but rituals sanctified by God's law and empire. By calling suffering sacred, Egypt turned abuse into duty, violation into ritual, and death into servitude. It is easy to recoil, to judge them across millennia, yet the lesson does not belong to Egypt alone. Look closer, and the patterns repeat. Wherever power cloaks itself in divinity or ideology, exploitation follows. Sacred prostitutes of Egypt are mirrored in girls trafficked under the guise of devotion. Royal incest finds its echo in dynasties and elites who hoard bloodlines at any cost. Ritual defloration reappears in practices that disguise violence as tradition. Even necrophilia has its shadow in the desecration of the powerless by those entrusted to guard them. Egypt reminds us that civilizations justify anything when they call it holy. The mask may change religion, politics, culture, but the face beneath is the same, power feeding on the vulnerable. The silence of Egypt's walls is a warning. Great civilizations fall not only through conquest, but through the rot they refuse to name. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still rise, but the empire that built them is gone. What remains is the echo. Suffering sanctified becomes the seed of collapse. You lift your torch one final time. The mirrors fade, the passage brightens. You emerge into sunlight, the desert wind sharp against your face. Behind you lie corridors of stone that still whisper across 3,000 years, of beauty and brutality, devotion and degradation, eternity and silence. Egypt's glory is undeniable. So too are its shadows. And the true legacy of the Nile is not just what it built, but what it warns, that behind every monument we must ask what was sacrificed to raise it.